a lot of the state representatives named him the little governor, meaning Josh Duggar. It's foreshadowing because for any of us who have followed the story, we know where his story heads. And it's like this sad moment of this little boy where there seemed like potential, dad had ambition, and there were designs on this kid from when he was very young. Hello and welcome back to my channel. And if you're new, then welcome. I would love to earn your subscription with this video and this series. We're starting a new series today. I thought around the 2-year anniversary of the release of this documentary, it could be insightful, fun, but fun's not really the right word for it. Interesting, valuable to go through the documentary that was released 2 years ago this June. It was released in 2023 and it's called Shiny Happy People, Duggar Family Secrets. It is all about not just the Duggar family, although that's certainly the focus of the documentary, but it's also zooming out about the larger culture that surrounded them. So let's dig in. The first thing that we find in this documentary is Jill was Duggar, now she's Dillard, on the couch with her husband, and she's like sitting down and getting herself ready, and they're kind of looking at each other and nervous, and she makes the comment, this is going to be difficult. And then it cuts to their cousin Amy, and she says everyone knew them, and she kind of hints at that she was on this show. And she says at some point she asked her uncle, so Amy is the Duggar cousin, who she is Jim Bob's niece, and she says, you don't even believe in TV. Why are you doing a TV show? Which is a great question. And he says, well, this is a ministry. And so that's how the whole thing is set. And it's actually a good setting for me to clarify some things. I want to say from the outset, I am not entering this discussion with a sense of gossip or salacious, let's pull out the grittiest details and just rake them over the coals. I'm not about that. I'm also not like one to have some macabre sense of glee or triumphant rejoicing over someone else's downfall. I don't feel that. I don't want that. I am not joyful about those things. And it's also not out of hatred. I have no personal, sense of animosity or irritation or skin in the game. But I will say, here are the goals that I have, which is that we would observe truth together. We would talk about what's true, what was true in that situation, and what does it mean about what's true currently or what's largely true in the world. Learning wisdom, discernment, how to spot error. Speaking up for weak and vulnerable people is another goal that I have, of just the child exploitation that happened through this show, but also not just that. And I'll get into more as we go through, but the treatment of women is a uniquely evil approach in this whole system of thinking. And so we're going to talk about that, as well as just exploring topics that intersect with my own story, my own life, and our own decision making. I do want to say, just like Amy's question of, you don't even believe in TV, why are you doing a TV show? I just want to say, for the record, in regard to the Duggars, Jim Bob made himself and his family a spectacle. These were choices on his part. There were contracts involved. This was not kind of like stumbled into it and accidentally got on the front cover of People magazine or something. This is an intentional, purposeful choice and series of choices over time that were made to pursue fame and being in front of everybody's eyeballs. He got rich from it. That's important to remember. His son imitated that example and did both of those things too, pursued fame and got wealthy from it. And then they all set themselves up as examples and pillars for the rest of us. And so that makes it fair game for public conversation. Just like reading a historical biography, we can learn from people's stories. We can notice what is true. We can take their example and either emulate it if it's something we deem worthy of emulation, or work to avoid those attitudes, characteristics, beliefs, behavior patterns if they are things that we wish to avoid. I also need to give you a very quick personal introduction. I don't normally do this in the middle of biographies or when we are reading a book about the royal family or a book about JFK. However, this particular set of stories somewhat intersects with my life story. And I just want to give a quick overview of that so you and I are both clear about that from the start. Number one is that the organization that we are going to be talking about, IBLP/ATI. I was never a part of that. I was public schooled, but I went to a youth group where there were at our church a number of ATI youth that were not allowed to come to youth group. And we would rarely interact and sometimes become friends at different, for the Easter play or that kind of thing. And so for 30 years, I've watched Gothardism, ATI, the homeschooling movement, and how it's been impacted by that movement. So that's number one, is that for 30 years I've watched these things play out. Number two is that while I was in college, I went to college in Arkansas, and then after I graduated, I got a job as a committee secretary in the Arkansas State Capitol in Little Rock. And Jim Bob was on one of my committees. I happened to be the committee secretary. I made the copies for the committee, and I made sure there was coffee made, and I made sure that they all had, copies of the bill and any evidence that was needed for the discussion and all those things. And so I shook his hand. We had a few low-key conversations. There's probably a committee photo out there somewhere with he and I both in it, but that was the duration of our interactions in that regard. I remember seeing Josh and his siblings pushing around their siblings in the Capitol building in a stroller. It was definitely a topic of conversation. It was definitely something we all noticed. So that was an intersection point. And then from there, I have been a homeschooler. After that point, I got married. We had children and decided to homeschool, not for the same reasons, not with this organization. But I stayed home with our children and have homeschooled them. We have a large family. We do have 9 children. Again, not for these reasons, but because we enjoyed children and I have had healthy pregnancies, and it's been a blessing in our lives to have children. But not because we were trying to outdo anybody or follow this method. But I have a large family, and therefore many people have made assumptions about our family and assumed that we were of this variety. Not only that, but we have been in church cultures and homeschooling circles where we have interacted abundantly with ATI or formerly ATI families. And so I say all that to say, I have a personal history with this. I'm not going to belabor it anymore, but where those things intersect or where I have personal or specific observations about those things, I'm going to bring those to the table. And I just want you to know a little bit of where I'm coming from in that regard. So the narrator introduces us to IBLP, Institute for Basic Life Principles, and particularly the man at its center. This was a ministry run by a man named Bill Gothard. And some things you need to know about Bill Gothard is that he started this big movement that became its entire own ecosystem in American culture in the 80s and 90s, but also that he was a single man who never had any children of his own. So while he is going around to tens of thousands of people at one point, it grew to that size, giving these rock star type stadium filled teachings to people who were kind of hanging on his every word. He had no personal experience that he was teaching from. He was presenting all of these things as if they were rock solid biblical truth and mixing biblical truth with legalistic specifications about people's lives that led to the downfall that we're going to talk about in this entire documentary. The gist of it was have more children, do more good in the world. There was more to it than that, but that having more children was more godly, and that the purpose of you and those children was to do more good in the world. And one of the people, we get lots of like talking heads in this documentary, lots of people who either as like religious historians or personal youths who were raised in this environment, or people who tangentially were connected to the Duggars somehow. We get various people giving their testimonials or interviews. And one of them says, you've got this increasing fame of Bill Gothard and particularly the Duggars, alongside this creeping pandemic of abuse that was happening inside of the ministry. And so that's part of what this documentary seeks to make known. There's different voices testifying to the dangers of IBLP and what it worked out and wrought in their own life, what it brought about, and the damage that was done. We're told that homeschooling was the linchpin of this ministry, and it was the idea that, you know, there's famous quotes of like, if you send your kids to Caesar, don't be surprised if they come home Romans. And so the whole idea is that basically you and you alone can have all these babies, raise them all yourselves, shelter them and keep them away from anybody else. And also you need to be the sole vehicle for their education. Jim Bob's sister, Deanna, is kind of the closing quote of the introduction of the documentary. It's very interesting. She says, "I didn't know what was going on behind the scenes. They were just deceiving us all." So that's the context for the introduction, as we then get a broad picture look of this home in Northwest Arkansas. And it goes into Derek and Jill Dillard, who was Duggar. She says she's the fourth born Duggar. And she says, "I grew up on TV." And we see a montage of young Jill with braces and putting in the bread and pushing a stroller and doing it all with a massive smile on her face and that classic permed hair. And she lists out all of her siblings in order, which I will not attempt to do, but there are 19 siblings total, and she's the fourth, and they all start with the letter J. And so she goes through the list, and she actually kind of like has a hiccup over one of them and then keeps going. But that's quite a list of names to keep in order, to be honest. And so then they take us back into Jim Bob and Michelle's story, and we're taken back into like the 70s, and we get to hear Michelle's baby voice. And I say that not meanly, but it is true. There is a voice that is admired in these circles that is very much like this sweet little, like tiny, please don't hurt me, please don't do anything to me, I'm just going to be as submissive as possible type of voice. And it is honored. And I have been told that it was taught at one point, that there were seminars about the voice. But we hear her voice saying, "I wasn't like Jim Bob. I had dated. I had gotten messed up in all of the boyfriend-girlfriend stuff." And like, she's just implying that she was just so broken and she was just so messed up. And then he comes as a, discipleship evening opportunity for his church. And he comes, and they got married when she was 17 and he was 19. So here's another theme that we see is the marriage is happening before there is a real reckoning with life at all. 17 and 19. And then he explains that they had their first baby, they got on the birth control pill, and the birth control pill, according to them, led to a miscarriage. And she gets choked up really fast. And she just starts crying. They're on stage telling their story, and she just cries and says, we just had to pray, and we just had to, and I don't want to mock that. I have experienced my own miscarriages, and I know the sorrow of that. For me personally, that's not something that I would performatively share with others. I think their motive, if you asked them to put the best spin on it, they would say like, well, we had experienced this terrible thing that was an outflow of our own decision making. And so we want to do all that we can to help others avoid that same pitfall. And as far as that goes, I mean, that's honorable motivation for sharing. And we don't know the context. We don't know if it's like at a local church or just what she's doing. But anyway, she's sharing, and she says that once they repented, that God granted them twins. And that from that point on, they just decided that the Lord was going to have control over their fertility. There are different phrases that are used in these circles, but one is to have as many children as God will give you. Another is to say, let God have control over your fertility. So it's all very wrapped up with faithfulness to God is connected to how many children I have, how willing I am to hold no control in this area, that those two things are tied together. Jill lays out the Duggar belief, which was you need to have as many children as you're capable of having until God changes that in your body. Basically, until your menopause naturally dies out, you just are to keep having babies, and at the end just having often a lot of miscarriages. And then they were told that the grandparents had concerns about her health, and that Jim Bob had 3 businesses. We're told about car sales and a towing business, and she remembers, her tucking into the car with him while he was doing these various businesses. And she says we would find all of the kids eat free places. And we would just say, we're going to run them out of business. And the whole thing is pretty gross. Honestly, it makes me really sad. Like, I'll just tell you, we do not do that. I think a lot of kids eat free places, honestly, have gotten a little smarter of like, you get 1 free kids meal with 1 adult meal or whatever. But even that, like, I remember a season where there was this season in our lives when we could go to Denny's, and it was still like we might go once a month, for the Denny's, like, kids eat free with parents sort of deal. So I just think it's really grotesque behavior to like take advantage of this and to put that on your community. I think that's cheap and rude. But I also just want to interact a little bit with this idea about fertility, not to preach my own views, but just to talk about this particular idea in general. As a Christian, which I am a Christian, we're taught that children are a blessing. So whatever view we take on this, all of us as Christians should have the view of children being a blessing. So we would never take a position that treats children like an irritant, like a parasite, like something that's taking from us that we want our life back, please. Like, that should never be our attitude. That even if there's a pause or a complete ending of fertility for whatever reason, it should never be like, psh, see ya, kids. We can't wait to not have that be a possibility, because children are a gift, and so we should have that kind of attitude. The other thing is that these rules that they made are completely not found in Scripture. There is no let God have fertility or have control of your fertility. There's no phrase like that in the Scriptures. And so this attitude is more like, there were people who were teaching in the time of Jesus that were called Pharisees. And it was like, if this was the Jewish law, then they kind of built a cage around the Jewish law so that you couldn't even get close to breaking the law. And I feel like this is that. Like, it is good to have children. God made our bodies to where for most of us, when natural things happen in a marriage, it's going to lead to children. And over the course of time, our modern ideas of like have 1 or 2 and be done wasn't the case, because it couldn't be. And so the natural order that God built into our bodies is a fairly lengthy season of fertility where children are possible. And so we can take from like the Scriptures that children are a blessing, and the design that there's like this 20, 25 year window of women's fertility, that God likes kids, right? And so that we should have a positive attitude towards children, and that we shouldn't have a clamped down, angry attitude about having children. But all the rest of it is like building out a cage of like, don't even get close. Don't even get close to thinking that children are not a gift. Like, you have to have as many as possible. And you just take your hands off that wheel. Like, God's got this. You just let him have as many as possible. And my biggest question after pondering this for, like I said, about 3 decades, my biggest question is like, there's nothing else, even things of value, that we do this with. Like, we don't literally take our hands off our car wheel. My own garden, I don't just like throw some seeds out and like see what sticks. Like, I plant in particular places, and I think through, how many plants can this garden bed hold? How many can I water successfully? How much do we have the capacity for here? Also things like, this year, this gardening season, how many should I plant given my current restrictions in life? But in a business, and even Jesus, he says, when you set out to build a tower, we all recognize it's foolish to start building the tower without considering the cost. So Jesus himself laid out the idea of count the cost of what a building enterprise would look like. And I think there are principles there from the world, from the way we relate to anything that we do of value in life, and then also Jesus' own teachings, that we can say, pondering the path of your feet and making careful, discerning decisions that might even include some careful, like, it would be highly disadvantageous right now. My mom's got dementia, for us to have a baby this year. Like, I'm caring for her every day. Let's use some measures to pause that for a little bit while we get through this season. And not even that extreme, but I'm just saying there are seasons where it's clear. I've had friends with health problems where they've had to completely either limit or cut off their fertility for either years or completely because of those health conditions. So there are plenty of reasons why someone might either pause or prayerfully decide to close down their fertility without it being a sin issue, without it being something where they just don't trust God and they have no faith. And I think that's a really poor way of viewing it. I think it sets people up towards judgmentalism toward one another. I think it sets up a competition aspect that I have 100% seen in these circles of trying to outdo others in how many children you have. I've been in a church where people said, oh, they're gaining on you. And I said, I'm not in a race. I'm not racing anybody. This is too hard and too big of a decision to be trying to outdo anybody else in numbers. So that is that issue. Now, Deanna, his sister, tells us a little bit about Jim Bob's background. She says, we were brought up by missionary Baptists, which meant no dancing. She didn't even get to wear pants for a long time. And she says, essentially, that's why I let my daughter have more freedom, that she realized she had been in a very restrictive environment. She didn't want that for her daughter. And so Amy, this bright, young cousin that was roughly Josh's age, I think she was maybe a little bit older than Josh. She's Jim Bob's niece, and she says, so I'm the crazy cousin, which she was. I actually remember watching the show. We had little children at the time that the Duggar show came out, and we actually lived abroad during those years. And so I didn't catch them all right away. I would catch them in blips if we came back for a visit and we'd be at my mom's house and she'd say, you want to put on the Duggars? And it was a clean show that I knew my kids wouldn't encounter something filthy, and my mom enjoyed it. So we would watch it. And it was this is wild. This is, it's kind of crazy, whatever. But we would watch it. And I remember Amy being this breath of fresh air. She was silly. She was a little crazy. She brought some spice into their lives. And it was kind of fun to see that okay, they still maintain family relationships. That looks healthy. And I didn't know everything, of course, that was going on. But to me, back then, that was my thought of oh, okay, that's a little more open than I would have pictured. So there's clips of Amy on 16 kids and counting, 17 kids and counting. And she says, and we're given clips from the children too of we were super close with the Duggars. She says like sometimes on her recess that she remembers like slipping out of the school fence and just going, because they lived right there close to where her school was. And so she'd go and see the cousins and spend time with them and then scoot back over when it was time to get back to the class. And, but they were definitely different. So they all like would have like an honoring stance toward her. And yet it was like clear that like she wore pants and she wore makeup and she was a little crazy. And so she points out that the Duggars she knew they were very strict. She knew they had no television. And then she explains the phenomenon of pantaloons. Her husband doesn't know what pantaloons are. And so she explains like little cotton bloomers under dresses, so that, like voluminous fabric under the skirt, so that everything was modest and kept nice. And but then there's a picture of Jim Bob baptizing her in 2011. And so there's plenty, my point in saying that even is that there's plenty of credibility that she really looked up to their family. Like despite the differences, despite the clear, like she's that and we're this, that there was a respect and love that seemed to be there at that time. And she says, I admired my uncle. I remember thinking, is he going to be president? And that's what leads us into the final part of our discussion, which is his ambitions and the trajectory that got them to having their own show. So in 1997, they went to a pro-life rally at the Arkansas Capitol building, and he got called up to speak. And through that experience, he says, God put it on my heart to get involved. He had met the governor, who at that time was Governor Mike Huckabee, who is still in politics. His daughter is the governor now of Arkansas. He ran for office and he was elected as the Republican representative for his area up in the Northwest. And so she says, we moved to Little Rock for the legislative session. So they actually got a house down during the legislative session. And there's this creepy moment where we have a quote from Jim Bob. But what he says is a lot of the state representatives named him the little governor, meaning Josh Duggar. It's foreshadowing because for any of us who have followed the story, we know where his story heads. And it's like this sad moment of this little boy where there seemed like potential. Dad had ambition. And there were designs on this kid from when he was very young. So the little governor is there, Dad's there. She says Dad ran twice and was elected twice. And in 2002, and during that time is when my path intersected with his. And it was buzzy. People were talking about him. He had been elected twice and he was a big deal. He was noticed. His family made him noticed. There were times when they would sing at the Capitol, just different things where they were being noticed and making a splash. And in 2002, he runs for the U.S. Senate. He loses that seat, but a religious historian named Kristen Kobus-Dumais says, even though Jim Bob loses, this very race is the thing that changes their trajectory because the New York Times takes a photo. At some point during the race, they write a little article about it, and it makes a splash in the New York Times. And that post triggers then a magazine feature article. And so their family is featured in Parents Magazine or People Magazine, but they're featured in a pretty high profile mainstream magazine and getting attention and all of that. And at this time then, they show all of this montage of the kinds of shows that were getting attention on Discovery Health. But we're talking about hair replacement surgeries happening live on TV. We're talking about medical oddities like conjoined twins. How do they live their lives? And then they're like going through but kind of shoddy video work, while the girls are walking past or whatever. And so the point is kind of oddball stories are starting to get featured on Discovery Health channel. They reach out to Jim Bob. And you can already see the foreshadowing from Amy's comment of, well, this is a ministry. The motivation that will lead Jim Bob to take this on. But also, I want to point out this other path that he was on has failed. He's a business owner, yes, but clearly he has higher ambitions. He got a taste of that, wheeling and dealing, getting stuff done in Little Rock. He wanted it for the U.S. Senate, lost it. This seems to be the path. And so this is kind of where we're left right now. We are halfway through episode 1, and I'm going to leave it there, but I want to hear from you. Do you remember this series? What did you make of it at the time? And can you differentiate that, how you felt about it when it first came out or when you first encountered this kind of odd family, but they seemed kind of sweet. She talked extraordinarily syrupy. The kids seemed really well behaved. Everybody matched. What did you think about that? How, on your odd meter, how odd was it? But also on your oh wow, impressed meter, where did you fall in that versus how you see these things now? And I think some of these things, even as a culture, we did not grapple with like we do now. What is the proper role of reality TV when it intersects with children? And is that child exploitation? And how do we navigate that, right? As viewers, but also just as part of the society at large. And then did you have any personal interactions with IBLP, Bill Gothardism, his homeschool curriculum, ATI, the Duggars, their books, all of that? How did you interact with these ideas? Were you judged by them? Were you in a homeschool circle? Were you parented by these ideas? I would just love to hear in the comments. I will say, in case this video draws in some new viewers who are not to our channel, on my channel, we are kind to each other and we interact respectfully. And so even if you disagree, I would just ask, treat the other person like a human being. That's the way we do here on this channel. And so I'm going to enforce that in the comments. I hope you'll abide by it. No personal put downs. But other than that, let's have a great discussion in the comments. I can't wait to hear from you guys, and we'll see you for the continuation of episode 1 and beyond in Shiny Happy People, the Duggar Family's Secrets. Hope you have a great day. Bye.